I mean, it landed me in hospital twice. On one occasion, members of the public found me in an alleyway clutching a bottle of vodka, and this was what the nurse told me when I woke up in hospital the following morning. And I remember her telling me the story, and I remember thinking, I need more alcohol in this moment to deal with the anxiety and the shame that this situation is causing me. And I stood up from the hospital bed and I tried to escape the hospital, and the police had been called. And next thing I knew, I was in the back of a police car, and my parents had been called. And I remember seeing my mum looking at me through the glass of the police car with this just look of fear and desperation in their eyes, not knowing how to help me.
That must have been a real pinpoint moment of something you've obviously really held on to, of, wow, this is like rock bottom. For my next guest, we have Alex Partridge. He is the founder of Unilad and Lad Bible. We talk all things about his ADHD diagnosis, alcoholism, and everything in between. He's also a podcast host of the show ADHD Chatter. Welcome to the show, Alex Partridge. Welcome to Managed.
Oh, thank you.
Very excited.
Thanks for having me on. Thank you.
I'm so glad that you could come on. Obviously, I would say you are one of the most probably inspiring people that I've met. Like in this industry, especially, you are like a Facebook pioneer and a leader in that sense. So I just wanted to kind of start by going through a little bit of a background. I know you've spoken about it on a lot of different podcasts and in different forums, but I wanted to just kind of go through it a little bit briefly for anyone who doesn't know, your career and how you began and the things you're doing now, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I've always been very entrepreneurial from a very young age. Thinking back to my very early years, I was always quite unconventional, to the point where my parents were often concerned for my behaviour.
Oh, really? Anything in particular?
Which was very isolating, and the entrepreneurial stuff I did from a young age was always by myself. I would look at the board games in my parents' house and look at the addresses of the company that manufactured them, and I spent a whole week designing my own board game and putting all the branding together and doing all the instructions, and sent it off to all of these board game manufacturers. And about 6 weeks went past, I didn't hear anything. And then one of them got back and said that they weren't looking for any new designs at the moment, but to always lean into that entrepreneurial side of you.
Do you think they knew your age? How old roughly were you at the time?
Yeah, I think they definitely knew I was like 6, because my handwriting was probably not very legible. But they got back, and they were really nice, and they just said to always lean into that entrepreneurial side.
You started quite young of having like some really out of the box ideas. I think most of us at 6 probably weren't doing that. I think I was still eating dirt or something at that point. So, and then it developed from there. So obviously about 21, you started Unilad at university. Was that your first business idea that you tried to launch, or was it one of many?
No, so it was my third. And I didn't want to go to university at first. I really wanted to lean into that entrepreneurial side of me. So straight after college, I started a business website called Quick Presents. And it was, if you needed to buy a present for a loved one or a relative, you would come onto my website and put in their interests, and my sort of back algorithm would suggest some presents to buy them. And it had a relationship with Amazon, so it was money making. But I remember so clearly my interest for it went from like a million miles an hour to completely dropping off a cliff. My interest completely disappeared, and I abandoned that.
You found out that obviously you had a diagnosis of ADHD. From what I have seen from your podcast, and obviously there's so much going around about ADHD, that is a sign, or a symptom, I guess, of being ADHD, of being so excited and then sort of losing interest very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the boom and bust cycle. It's getting that new idea, staying up all night, buying the domain, hyper focusing on it for weeks, and whether that sticks or not, whether in a week or 2 weeks or a month, you're still going to have that interest. I found more often than not, it disappeared, the motivation, and I abandoned that project. And that was the same really for like my second business. So after that first business, I kind of thought I should go to university, because that knocked my confidence a bit when I lost interest in that first business. In my first year of uni, I spent half my student loan on a giant freezer. I went to Tesco and bought loads of frozen pizzas. I made a Facebook page called Easy Pizza. And it was, if people wanted pizzas in the middle of the night, they could text me. I'd throw a pizza in the oven and I'd get on my bike and deliver it.
It's like early delivery.
Yeah, I mean, literally. But I again, my motivation for it completely disappeared after about 3 months. And at that point, I'd actually got 4 people working for me, cycling around Oxford, delivering these pizzas, and yeah, my interest completely just disappeared, and I just abandoned it. Like
you didn't sell it or anything. You just literally just shut it down. Yeah,
completely just shut it down. Like once that interest fades, it's such a powerful force. I didn't have the understanding at the time that was probably an ADHD boom and bust cycle, and that was the other side of it. I was coming down in the bust part of that cycle. But it doesn't knock your confidence. It really makes you question your ability. But that was the second time that had happened.
Yeah. So obviously you were there at university, you went to Oxford Brookes. And what were you studying?
Hospitality.
Oh, that's different to what I thought it would be.
Yeah, I mean, I only went to one lecture.
Congrats.
No, I mean, it wasn't, I didn't know what to study. I literally picked a course out of a hat and went. I don't know what my motivation was for going to university. I just, probably because there was some pressure from my peers and that was kind of what everyone else was doing. So I just buckled in the end and went to university. But I remember I went to one lecture and I sat in the back of the lecture hall and I remember the lecturer called me out and said, "Alex, do you know the answer to this question?" And I could feel
when people do that.
Yeah, and it reminded me of school. I could feel my face go red, my palms go sweaty, my breath getting harder to breathe and my heart rate speeding up. And I stood up and I left the lecture hall and I bumped into someone in the corridor and I said, "You need to call an ambulance. I'm having a heart attack." Okay. And by the time that arrived, I had calmed down. I wasn't having a heart attack. I was having an anxiety attack.
It's quite a severe reaction to stress. And I think anxiety can really just take form in different ways. Was that your first experience of something so severe?
No, I had one when I was younger, very similar, playing computer games with a friend, really young. And the same sensation, felt my face go red, my heart speeding up, my breath getting difficult to breathe. And I had an anxiety attack when I was really young. I now know that it was masking and this deep, like constant subconscious shape-shifting and almost trying to fit in and appear a certain way amongst other people was causing all this anxiety that occasionally in certain situations bubbled over into a full-blown anxiety attack.
God, I think a lot of people would probably relate to that, especially as we speak more and more about mental health and, neurodiversity. So I guess from that moment, what point did you think, right, okay, I've got this really great idea for, was it Unilad that was the first initial, and then you went to Lab Bible. So at what point did you think, right, this is a great idea? I guess because you guys were really the pioneers of, video content. No one was really doing that at the time. And it was probably the first, I think, page that I followed. I'm 29 now, so I think it must be when I was at uni. That was a long time ago, like 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So it's always kind of been a pioneer. But did it start like that for anyone who maybe doesn't know the full ins and outs of how Lab Bible did start?
Yeah, I mean, so Unilad came first. That was in my second year of university. I was in a relationship and she was the editor of a online magazine. And we broke up. She broke up with me and I was genuinely heartbroken. And I remember sat in my room thinking in a really like analytical, logical way at the time. I thought, well, if I started something similar to her hobby, that might make her think that we had something in common and I would win her back. And I didn't want to step on her toes too much or be a direct competitor. Hers was sort of directed at female students. So I thought I'd start something aimed at male students. So the name Unilad came quite quickly.
I guess you were a uni lad.
Yeah, I mean, so that was the initial motivation. But once I made the Facebook page and I started putting the content out and seeing all that engagement and the likes and shares and comments coming in, I quickly forgot about my initial motivation, which was the breakup, and just became obsessed with that world of social media.
Was it quite quickly you realised this is going to absolutely blow? And I guess, did you also have that inner fear of, after 3 months, am I going to lose my motivation? Similar to the first business and second business? Yeah,
so the point that it grew really quickly. The content was almost, our post after post after post was getting traction, and the Facebook page grew to around 500,000 in about 3 weeks. And there was messages from big brands, Domino's, Amazon, lots of others messaging me asking to be featured on the Facebook page. So that was like the moment where I thought, okay, this has got something, this has got commercial viability. It was always in the back of my mind whether this was going to be a short-term hyperfixation like my other ones, or whether this was going to last. I think, and I've spoken to a lot of people about this who know a lot more about the science of ADHD than I do, and they think that the reason why social media has always been the constant in my life is because it gives me that loop of dopamine. I can always post something and the feedback from my audience is instant. The likes, the shares, the comments.
Yes, it's an instant gratification. So at this point now, 40 million people globally were watching, everything that you were posting. At what point did you think, right, it's time to sort of step away?
So I sold Lad Bible a while ago in 2013. Unilad, I officially exited Unilad in 2018. So it felt like I had made my mark on social media, and I was happy to move on at that stage.
Well, I think a lot of people still very much recognize the brand, and I think it's absolutely completely inspiring. I think so many things have come off the back of it, even like Wall of Comedy. You saw all these people start popping up. So even now you've exited, do you still watch and think, wow, this is incredible what I've created?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm a big social media user. And I never really, after that, I went on to help other agencies grow their social media following. So I was always in that world. I was always building communities on Facebook primarily, and then Instagram. I was always after that dopamine rush that getting a viral post or building a meaningful community gave me.
Whilst building these communities, you were very young when you began this business, and obviously it scaled very quickly. The anxiety and stress of running that business and, being overwhelmed with that, at any point did you think, right, this is too much, I can't do this anymore? Especially I think there's a lot of young people now who are launching businesses and they're glamorized massively online, but no one actually talks about the hardships of scaling, running a business, losing friends along the way. Is that something that you look back on and think, wow, I don't know how I got through that point? Or if I'd got my ADHD diagnosis earlier, I would have been able to handle that a lot better.
Yeah, definitely. I think when the social media was taken away from me, or I stepped away from the community building and that dopamine tap was turned off, I didn't know at the time that I would probably need to fill that void with something else. And for me, it was alcohol. I remember really clearly coming back from university, specifically after I sold Lad Bible. So I had a big chunk of my sort of entrepreneurial activity removed, and to fill that void, which that was giving me, I started drinking. I started drinking to excess for about 3 years, and I can look back at that now with the sort of with the lens of ADHD and seeing that what was giving me so much dopamine and so much stimuli for my brain, when that was taken away, of course I was going to look for it in alternative, really unhealthy ways. And it landed me in hospital twice. On one occasion, members of the public found me in an alleyway clutching a bottle of vodka, and this was what the nurse told me when I woke up in hospital the following morning. And I remember her telling me the story, and I remember thinking, I need more alcohol in this moment to deal with the anxiety and the shame that this situation is causing me. And I stood up from the hospital bed and I tried to escape the hospital, and the police had been called. And next thing I knew, I was in the back of a police car, and my parents had been called. And I remember seeing my mum looking at me through the glass of the police car with this just look of fear and desperation in their eyes, not knowing how to help me.
It must have been a real pinpoint moment of something you've obviously really held on to of, wow, this is like rock bottom.
Yeah, that's what took me into Alcoholics Anonymous. My parents didn't know how to help me. There was no history of alcoholism in the family, in the immediate family. They knew someone who was in Alcoholics Anonymous. He took me to my first AA meeting, and the denial is so strong. And I remember sat in my first AA meeting and thinking, I don't belong here. I don't need to be here. And then I heard people share their stories, and I burst into tears. And I thought, this is exactly where I need to be. And I wish that now I know why the link between ADHD and alcoholism is such a strong link. It's that chasing dopamine. If you're not getting it in a healthy way, like I was with social media, when I let go of Lad Bible, I wish that I could go back and just give myself that understanding and saying, don't go for that alcohol. Don't go to that petrol station and buy that bottle of vodka. There's healthy ways to supply that dopamine.
So at that point, you were very successful. So it wasn't that you were in a bad place in terms of the business. You were successful. You'd let go, and that was that feeling of like overriding something's missing. And like you said, the dopamine level that kind of gave. If someone was in a similar situation now, what advice would you give as like a coping mechanism outside of, going for the first thing that, you see of alcohol, especially alcohol is so heavily advertised as, Britain with this fun-loving alcohol country, we get drunk and we watch football. I think if you were to talk to someone who maybe was going through something similar to what you were, what would your first initial thing you'd say?
I think work on your self-awareness. And it's easier said than done, because I think you have to go through that process. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't go through that process, you don't have that evidence for you to know that you can't drink in moderation. Like I can never drink in moderation. It's when I have a drink, I can't stop drinking and I had to go through that process multiple times and go to hospital and come out the other side to have that self-awareness. And if you can journal, I do it now every day, or if you can't do it every day, as often as you can, just really think. It's like sit on the end of your bed and say, like, what happened today, or what happened this week that made you happy? What happened this week that made you upset? What frustrated you? What gave you joy? And if you do that enough, then you can really build up quite a strong arsenal of self-awareness, and you can gather quite a lot of data, and you can say, okay, that is what makes me happy. That's what intrinsically gives me joy. I didn't have that when I sold Lad Bible. I had no idea what actually made me happy outside of social media. So when that got taken away, I found the bottle very quickly. If I knew what intrinsically made me happy, now it's my dog. Silly things like my dog, my dog, my going for a run. There's things that give me intrinsic happiness now that isn't alcohol. I didn't have that awareness 10 years ago.
I've seen it on like a different side where I have had alcoholism in my family. So I think when you see different people like that, you do learn personally that you where you don't want to be or how it could be. And potentially that's kind of how you now feel about yourself rather than seeing it from somebody else.
Yeah, definitely. I think you can, if you see a family member really struggling, you can see the pain that it's caused the family, then that can create a phobia, and you don't want to recreate that. You don't want to relive that on yourself. You don't want to put your loved ones through it, because alcoholism causes devastation to the individual, but the damage that it does to everyone that loves that person is tenfold. The constant worry of they're alone tonight in a hotel, they're on holiday, they're not supervised tonight, and it sounds patronizing, but that's when people relapse. Often is when they're sort of separated from their support group and they're in a hotel room on their own, or they're away from their normal routine. And that constant worry, anxiety that their loved ones and friends go through is often actually a motivating factor to why people don't drink. It certainly was for me.
When obviously you came out of, your alcoholism, is that when you started sort of soul searching and going, right, I'm going to get this ADHD diagnosis? Or was there one pinnacle sort of thing that you thought, oh, maybe I should get diagnosed?
I think the diagnosis came from when COVID started. I was not doing anything, and I was in my flat really for 2 years playing computer games, doing very little. And it was such I sold Unilad, and I remember at the time thinking, oh, I've retired, I don't need to work again.
That must have been a great feeling.
I mean, yeah, for sure it was in the short term for about 6 months, but then 2 years went past of doing nothing. I went on some nice holidays. It was, but then the low self-esteem comes back, and you start getting down and anxious that you're not doing anything. And I wanted to start a podcast. That was kind of my thing to get me out of this mindset. So I spent a small fortune on a podcast studio. I ripped my bedroom apart and turned it into a podcast studio similar to this one. I was going to call it Walk Away Wiser. And all of the equipment turned up. It was about like 5 cameras, 2 mics.
Oh, you went hard.
Yeah, I mean, I hired a producer, I hired a director, I hired an editor, had about 7 people on the payroll. And then literally all the equipment turned up and I didn't want to do the podcast anymore. It was another one of those boom or bust cycles.
Yeah, that is quite an extreme way of like, this is the idea, I'm just going to roll with it. And then it arrives going, maybe not today.
Yeah, I mean, I had booked about 15 guests, some of them pretty high profile. It was going to be called Walk Away Wiser. It was going to go up against some of the top podcasts in the UK. That was my plan. I was so excited about it. And then, as happened in the past, my interest, and that was the thing, the guy who I hired to edit the show, he was diagnosed, and he said, like, this is an interesting pattern of behavior. And I told him about what happened in the past, and he said, have you ever been assessed for ADHD? Like, this is clear behavior in his opinion. And I hadn't thought anything of it. And I sort of defensively said no. But then I dived down the social media rabbit hole and Google. And the more I read about it, the more I saw myself in it. And yeah, the psychiatrist eventually said my ADHD was clear as hell after the assessment.
Oh, well, sorry. It's just your smile at the end really tickled me. Yeah, I think from speaking to you too, you can tell you're very logical as well. Like your thought process is extremely logical. And I guess for them, they might have thought, oh, maybe you would have been aware. Because obviously you've gone through this whole self-awareness journey. So for you now, looking back, are you like, oh my God, this is so clear as day. I've learned so much. And if you've been diagnosed really early on, do you think it would have helped, especially your self-esteem and everything else, and maybe even prevented, some like maybe the alcohol and things like that, or bearing in mind knowing how to cope, knowing about that dopamine rush and ADHD?
I think it would have given me huge validation and self-awareness from a much younger age. It would have explained my actions and the way I worked. Going back really when I was a child, I remember just hyperfixating on a bit in the playground. Everyone was digging holes at school, and I remember just hyperfixating on a bit in the playground and just isolating myself from other pupils and just being obsessed with a particular thing that day or another particular thing, and seeing that pattern of behavior of going all in on something and then losing interest in it. That over time chips away at your confidence and can build and can foster low self-esteem. So yeah, if I had that understanding earlier on, then at least there would have been an explanation as to why I was a little bit odd.
I don't think you're odd. I think you're great. But yeah. I think one of the things that I really loved is the fact that you obviously found this out through the podcast, but you now have a successful podcast called ADHD Chatter, and it is about ADHD. Do you think that you found something really wholesome and something that really has a purpose and cause within your podcast now? Because obviously you haven't had the big high and low of starting the podcast and then going, right, I don't want to do this anymore. And, from what I saw on your Instagram, number 51 in health and fitness on the charts. So congratulations, it's amazing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, it's 17 episodes in, 17 weeks. So it's very early still. And I'm not feeling that bust cycle approaching or even being a thing, which is fantastic. And I think for me, the reason is because it's so intrinsically linked to my motivation. My intrinsic motivation for starting the podcast was to learn about myself and to speak to as many people with ADHD in all aspects of life. Some have done very interesting things. Some are just very humble human beings, but they're all fascinating to speak to because every story is different. But learning about ADHD myself was my primary motivator. And if I can make those conversations public, then I thought that made sense.
Yeah, I think as well, we were speaking about it just briefly before we started filming. Obviously, there has been this whole huge boom, especially I've seen it on LinkedIn, of more people getting diagnosed, with neurodiversity and being really fascinated by their own behaviors of, seeing podcasts or, TikTok. Obviously, everyone's on TikTok. And it's like I saw one the other day, I was like, 5 signs that you've got ADHD. And I was like, God, I'm like all of those. But there's also, I guess, a little bit damaging where people can self-diagnose and go, right, I've got ADHD because I've got the 5 things this one video has said, what are your thoughts surrounding, that side of things of, is it something to be a little bit concerned about, or, is it a really positive thing that people are being really self-aware? And I think someone said to me the other day that everyone kind of has some slight neurodiversity within them. No one is completely, I am completely normal in that sort of sense. Everyone's got something different.
Yeah, I mean, I think the uptick on content around ADHD and neurodiversity is always good. I think there is a lot of content on TikTok and Reels that is perhaps slightly irresponsible in the way it's put out. I think there are some TikTok influencers that chase the algorithm and put out content that they know is going to get likes and views. And a lot of the time, the content behind that is not an indication that you have ADHD. Like, it's, I forgot my car keys, damn you, ADHD. And that will go like 10 million views and be a viral clip. And yeah, sure, it's funny, but that's not a sign that you've got ADHD. I mean, if you did that every single day and it caused you a lot of anxiety and stress and frustration and low self-esteem that you couldn't find your car keys every day, then perhaps that's something to consider. But it's just if you do that, from time to time, then that doesn't qualify a self-diagnosis of ADHD. I think a lot of content should probably come with a disclaimer to say that, yes, look, this is probably something everyone does, but I think it's the severity and the quantity of times that you do that type of behavior that might be an indicator that there might be something deeper there. And with the self-diagnosis, I think it is massively helpful because, firstly, to get a diagnosis, you either have to have a spare £1,000, £2,000 if you want to get assessed for a broader range of neurodiversity like autism as well, or you have to join a horrendously long waiting list of 3 to 7 years on the NHS. So getting a diagnosis and being able to seek the support, which a lot of people desperately need, getting a diagnosis is definitely for the privileged at the moment. So I think there is a value in self-diagnosis. I think deep down, people probably know if their symptoms, traits are affecting their life. I mean, to get the criteria for a diagnosis is you have to have these traits that have presented from childbirth. Really, it's a lifelong condition. And they have to have a really disabling and negative effect on your life. So if you've just recently started getting a bit stressed because you've forgotten your car keys, but it hasn't been there all your life, that potentially might not be ADHD. That might just be a reaction to something in the medium term, like the cost of living crisis or COVID.
I guess that is one of the things as well that people don't think is there is obviously other factors. And where you spoke about your anxiety attack and kind of learning later on that is connected to your ADHD, some people could think, I've started now with this anxiety attack and I've seen this thing that says that I've now got ADHD. I think that's where it can be a little bit detrimental because you can get really fixated. And I guess everyone is different. But I think one of the things that was really nice when we spoke about is obviously the linked influencer and the fact that there is some really amazing people talking about how workplaces can change, the way that, they cater for their staff and colleagues who have got neurodiversity. Is that something that you feel quite passionate about as well?
Yeah, definitely. I'm doing a lot of speaking and trying to raise awareness on this. Like, there's so much lost productivity in the workplace through employees not being able to open up and to ask for help and just suffering in silence. I think companies need to really make it clear that they're open to having an understanding about these conditions. And a lot of companies think, okay, we need to put reasonable accommodations in for our neurodivergent employees. That's going to be really expensive. But actually, a lot of the accommodations that make the biggest impact aren't expensive. So bring in neurodivergent speakers, for example, right at the recruitment phase. Be conscious of the language that you're using in job adverts. Many autistic people are very literal thinkers. So don't put must be a great communicator or must be very punctual if that's not absolute necessity for that job, because a lot of autistic people will look at that and they instantly won't apply for that job because they'll think, okay, well, I'm not a great communicator.
So they're losing candidates straight off the back who could be a perfect fit for a role just from lack of educating themselves on how best to even put the job advert out.
I just think clarity in the requirements for the job. So instead of great communicator, you could put great at writing emails or great at great in meetings, great in negotiating, great in copywriting. I think just broad stroke statements like a good communicator is so vague. And, a mind like mine would look at that and without that clarity and understanding of what exactly that means, that would put me off from applying. I think just more acute clarity on the job descriptions. And in the job interviews, if you get to that far, like always offer a virtual interview. And if that's not essential, then when the candidate turns up, I think we need to ditch outdated ways of judging someone's value. If someone hasn't got amazing eye contact, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're rude.
Sometimes people just feel very uncomfortable.
Yeah, eye contact can make people tremendously anxious. I can focus on what you're saying better if I'm looking over there. I'm getting better at it now. If I'm looking at you in the eye, that takes a lot of distraction away from my ability to think. And I'm among many, many people who feel the same. But so there are people who still judge people on their ability to keep good eye contact. So I think we need to ditch that. We need to give someone a bit of an allowance if they're 5 minutes late for the interview. I think employers need to recognize what anxiety looks like.
It's interesting because a lot of them actually do have anxiety themselves, but then they don't necessarily acknowledge it for their staff. And that's something that I've learned before. My old boss, he was an incredibly anxious person. But if I had anxiety, it was like, fix up. It couldn't have been both ways, because he ran the company. He could have been the only person who had any kind of, anxiety or stress. And I think that's something that's quite interesting when, you do hear stories of, people who they just feel they're in their own bubble of, only I can feel this way. And there's no allowance for anyone else to have any sort of personal feelings. Or even if they say, for example, someone who is neurodivergent and haven't been diagnosed, so they're just very in their heads and there's just no allowance by their employers to try and overcome or be in a scenario where they could just sit in a separate room. And, I know we were talking about Ellie Mitts earlier, and she talks about the fact that if there's too much noise in a room or there's too much going on, it really just sends like her brain into a bit of a standstill and she can't really function. And I think that's the first time people have really spoken about that side of it, rather than usually you label ADHD as like the loud kid. That's always how it was, taught to me in school. So now we're hearing all these different things. I find it fascinating to see how ADHD is really being focused on. And even like as someone who employs people myself, understanding, different people's needs. So I think, the things you speak about are so useful and helpful. I know that you also do TED Talks. Do you speak a lot about just, the business side of things, or do you also really venture into the ADHD side? Because I think they kind of come hand in hand.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the overlap between my past and the way I've worked, and the clear earlier understanding of neurodiversity, how it would have assisted me and how it would have assisted so many other people. And going back to what you said about Ellie Middleton, and I completely relate to being in an office. I worked in a marketing agency in 2016, and it was a busy office, loud music constantly playing, office dogs, ping pong tables. And my brain just paralyzed in that situation. And my job was to grow the Facebook for that marketing company. And I think I left after about 2 months, and I couldn't think. Like I grew their Facebook to around 5,000 in about 2 months. And I was the Unilad guy, so I had these huge expectations put on me. And that was causing me huge anxiety. Fast forward a year later, going into another agency, and with that understanding, I said, can I work downstairs in the canteen where it's quiet? Can I work from home sometimes? And within the same period, I grew their Facebook from 0 to 8 million. And it's just the difference between in the first agency, the constant noise of the ping pong table, the smell of the sensory overload. There was so much going on. And I was just sat there, and I can be completely honest, I didn't say this to them at the time. I was drinking. I was drinking alcohol in my break times to deal with the anxiety that was caused from not being able to meet the expectations that was put on me. And I don't blame them, because I didn't have an understanding to ask for accommodations at the time. This was a little while ago, neurodiversity wasn't really spoken about then. But now I look back with the understanding of my brain, and I'm like, whoa, I can see why I was paralyzed mentally in that job, and I couldn't do what I was being paid to do, and why I was drinking to deal with the anxiety and the lunch breaks. Then I fast forward to the next job where I had the understanding and I asked for accommodations and the difference in the results. I think people need to trust people and judge people on their outcomes and not the process. Because, if someone has a fidget spinner or uses noise cancelling headphones or does something that isn't perhaps considered normal, like don't make it a big deal. Just normalize that kind of behavior in an office and recognize what anxiety looks like. So much productivity is lost through neurodiversity manifesting into anxiety. Like, spot the signs of an anxious person. If someone's fidgeting more than they normally do, if someone's saying yes to everything, if someone's smiling with a rigid jaw, if someone's avoiding certain situations, that could be enough to send them a private email and saying, are you okay? Is there anything that we can need to help? And that might be enough for them to say, okay, this is a safe space for me to open up now and to say, yeah, actually, I am really suffering, struggling with anxiety. It's really interfering with what you're paying me to do. Can we have a chat about some accommodations?
I think when COVID, in the bizarre way of how weird that kind of 2 years period was, it opened up working from home so much more. That never used to be even something that we did, but we have that every week, once a week, everyone works from home. Some companies you can work from home anywhere in the world, and they don't mind if you're in Spain as long as you get the work done, amazing. But I think that has really opened up everyone's eyes that you don't have to be stuck in an office, and has seen a different level of productivity. I think the ping pong table is an interesting thing, because also where you're working in social media, there's this also pressure to be quite a cool office. People expect things. So I guess there is that balance in between of not everyone can work like that, but some people, they really thrive off that. So it's having both those conversations. But I think that what your point was about sending that email, I think that's so special. And even now, I know there are a lot of my friends who maybe work a bit more corporate jobs. They have like mental health mornings and they'll bring people in. And I think now people are just so much more aware. But I think only by everyone having to stand still for COVID did that really open up people's eyes to this. Before that, it was very much like go, go, go. And mental health was on the back burner and only a few influencers were really talking about it. So it's nice to see that we've kind of developed so much. And, it's nice to see, like, for example, your podcast. And, one of my friends actually has a podcast about ADHD. But hers is very different in a way of, she talks, I think, about like her childhood traumas of being a young woman who is kind of boxed as, she was told she had ADHD before she was diagnosed just because she was this loud woman. And it was kind of like, she would have to be like, shut up because you're too loud because you're ADHD. So everything's changing. And I think it's really special and it's really nice to see. So I'm like, congratulations on everything. Like, you really are an inspiration to, I think, so many. If there was part of your life, especially now that you're so much more self-aware, that you could manage differently, or maybe you're proud of how you have now managed it differently, what would that be?
I think I'm proud of myself I look back on my journey, a lot of it was anxiety filled, and and it still is to a degree. The understanding that I have now, it wasn't possible without going through all of that. I wish I could go back and say to my younger self that, the little kid that was having the anxiety attack and the boy who was having the anxiety attack at university, and go back with the understanding of ADHD and neurodiversity that I have now, and just put my arms around myself and say, you're not broken, you don't need to be fixed, and you're just a bit different, and that everything's going to be okay.
Oh, I think that's so lovely. Thank you so much for coming on. Honestly, this has been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Managed. If you loved watching, please make sure you're following us so you can receive updates on our next episode. I'll see you next week.